In yesterday's video, I talked about the many, many billionaires Donald is surrounding himself with and whom he's installing in the United States government and how dangerous that is. As I mentioned, the total wealth of Joe Biden's cabinet was $118 million. The combined wealth of Donald's cabinet and those in the executive branch, including Musk, is well over $500 billion. That matters. And I think it's important to have that conversation, as I did yesterday. However, today, I want to talk about the psychopathology of wealth from the perspective of my family. I grew up in a family in which money was literally the only currency. It's not that it mattered more than love or affection, it stood in for those things. My grandfather was a legitimately self made man, although I kind of take issue with the fact that anybody can become a billionaire alone. First of all, when he started his business, I think he was only about 15 years old. So he wasn't old enough to do it on his own. His mother started a business called Elizabeth Trump and Sons. She took care of all the paperwork and she had to sign all the checks because my grandfather was not an adult yet. So from the very beginning, he had his mother helping him out. And again, even though he was legitimately successful, over time, his success grew to the extent and with the rapidity with which it did, because he had so much government assistance. A man who hated paying taxes more than just about anything, a man who would decry the worthlessness of the poor, um, didn't want to pay taxes, even though he became a billionaire with the help of massive amounts of government funding. One of his first building large complexes was called Shore Haven. This was in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn. It comprised 32 six-story buildings, a shopping center, and it's spread over more than 30 acres. The reason he was able to build Shore Haven is because, yes, the government gave him $9 million in federal housing authority money that was paid to my grandfather directly. That probably helped. Uh, then he got the green light for another development. This was called Beach Haven. And this was a 40-acre, 23-building complex in Cody Island that netted him $16 million in FHA funds. Clearly, by then, my grandfather had discovered that the strategy of building his wealth on taxpayers' dime was the winner. So he was willing to take other people's tax dollars to benefit himself to build his projects, but he was completely unwilling to give anything back. And then in the late 60s, my grandfather, Fred, developed a high rise for the elderly, a project that was in part an exercise in how to get government subsidies. He received over $7.8 million for that one, which was practically an interest-free loan to cover 90% of the cost of the project's construction. So in other words, there was no downside there. But this was one of the first projects that was also indicative of how Fred would do business going forward, because much of the success of this project was almost solely to benefit Donald by throwing money at him that he hadn't earned. So, what do you do when you grow up in a family that only cares about money? How does that alter your psyche? How does that change your relationship to material wealth, but also human beings? Again, I've said this many times. My grandfather was a sociopath and not capable of love. But to those of us who were capable of love, what did it mean when you could tell how much you were valued by the family depended upon how much money you received from the family. So at one end, you had Donald Trump, who over the course of my grandfather's lifetime received about $412 million dollars. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have my father, who died poor while living in my grandparents' house and who had been reduced to, after being a professional pilot for TWA at the dawn of the jet age, a profession that was derided by my grandfather, to being part of a maintenance crew in one of my grandfather's largest complexes, Trump Village. That's what my dad was doing when he died at the age of 42, because in my grandfather's eyes, my dad had no worth at all. Sadly, my dad agreed with him. By the time he was at the end of his life, he didn't have any self worth. And it wasn't just my grandfather who didn't value my dad because he didn't produce income and he didn't have the kind of wealth that my grandfather created for his other children, but especially for Donald. The rest of my dad's siblings shared that opinion, and so did my grandmother, actually, which is something I didn't realize at the time. But when my dad died, as I mentioned, he had nothing. Well, that's not entirely true. He had trust funds, but he didn't have access to them. In terms of his own net worth, he had nothing. I think he died with maybe $1,000 in his personal checking account. So if you, like my grandfather, look at another human being through that lens, uh, you believe that that person is worth nothing, even if he happens to be your son, and even if you contributed the conditions under which that happened. So, again, when my dad died, he was essentially penniless, living with his parents and doing maintenance work for which he probably wasn't paid at a complex in a business that he, as a young man, thoroughly and legitimately believed he was going to take over later in life. The last thing my grandmother ever said to me when she found out that I was challenging my grandfather's will, because I had been completely disinherited, and that didn't seem entirely fair to me, because it also meant that my dad had been completely disinherited. In fact, my grandfather's will acted as if my father hadn't even existed. My grandmother said to me, "When your father died, you know what he was worth? A whole lot of nothing." So that's what money does to some people. And we're at a serious inflection point in our country when the wealth gap is widening. We're in robber baron territory when a handful of people can shovel hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars into an election that they essentially buy for the candidate of their choice, where one man can have more wealth than entire countries. Since the election, Elon Musk's net worth has grown by over $200 billion. He's now, quote unquote, worth over $450 billion. And worth is a very loaded word because a lot of people take that to mean that he is worth more, not just in monetary terms, but as a human being, as an intellect, as somebody who should have power simply by virtue of the fact that he has gamed a system where, after growing up a very wealthy person, he can accrue as much wealth as possible. Now, there are other substances. If you want to look at money as a substance for a second, there are other substances. If we overuse them, we look at that as addictive behavior. People can be addicted to alcohol, they can be addicted to drugs, they can be addicted to spending money, they can be addicted to sex, but we never look at the kind of acquisitiveness my grandfather, Donald, Elon Musk, and others engage in as being somehow pathological. And because we are a society built on capitalism, and because we keep putting into power people who do not believe that capitalism should be regulated, we get people with not only obscene wealth, but it's obscene access to other wealthy people and to a lot of power they have no business being anywhere near. The idea that tax rates for the wealthy are falling, the idea that the Republican Party and Donald once again will cut tax rates for the obscenely wealthy and for corporations is a sign of where we have gone wrong. Uh, I think Harry Truman in his administration, there was a tax rate of 90% on the ultra wealthy. If we're going to right the ship, we need to start doing that again. I don't understand why people should be allowed to accrue the kind of wealth that Elon Musk has or even that Donald Trump has. There need to be limits because otherwise the wealth becomes the point and the power becomes about perpetuating the wealth for the very, very few who, much like my grandfather, do not have our best interests at heart. Please don't forget to subscribe to our channel. It's free.